Hello there, welcome in, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another video lecture. This time we're going to talk about stress. We're going to continue our discussion about stress, and we're going to look at some more application to middle adulthood, as well as comparing men and women in general in terms of how we deal with stress. So it's definitely useful information, whether you're in your 40s like me or someone younger. It's very applicable and relatable in many different ways. All right, so let's go to our slides here and begin our discussion. So we're going to look at that section in the textbook there, stress and personal control. All right, so let's open up our sections here. Okay, now when it comes to middle-aged adults experience more what we call overload stressors. In other words, your sense of control when it comes to stress seems to be really challenged, and because there's a lot of demands being placed on you, possibly more demands than ever before when you reflect back in your life. In other words, it may seem very different compared to early adulthood, because now you have so many competing demands that are placed on you, whereas for a lot of young people, they're more able to focus on self-pursuits. Now remember, that's not always the case. It depends on your unique situation and scenario. There's always exceptions to that, but on average, in general, we would find that things kind of change a little bit in middle age, because now you may be overcommitted and you may have too many things kind of going on compared to where you have a lot more freedom when you're younger. So this is involved juggling too many activities at once. For example, you may be concerned about your kids, your own parents, which are aging, your career, all the different commitments in your life and your social life, whether it's PTA or sporting events and things like that. It just seems like there's all these pressures that are placed on you and you're having to deal with them sometimes at the same time. And so in general, we find for most people, these demands become very challenging and overburdening to the point where you're just simply overcommitted. So that's certainly true when I think of my own life, when I compare it to when I was younger, in my 20s, for example, because now it's kind of like, okay, I have all these papers I have to grade. Okay, then I have to pick up the kids at school. Then I have band practices at this night. Oh, wait a minute, I can't do that because you have your meetings. So you're going to drop off the kids. I'm going to get them later. So in other words, there's all this juggling stuff you have to do because you're so committed to all these things you have to do in your life. So we're finding that middle-aged people often feel overwhelmed by that because they may be raising their own kids and dealing with their career and interests. They're also having to assist their aging parents, having to do things for them or take them to doctor's appointments and things like that. So it just kind of gets to the point where, like I said, I can personally relate that you feel almost overcommitted at times to the point where you're going to explode. So you're going to have to find some way to kind of deal with that and make those demands happen or sort of satisfy those demands. Developmental changes in perceived personal control. So we do see some changes here. So our perception of self-control in terms of stress and things like that seems to peak in midlife, but then actually declines. So we're going to find that some of these may increase, some of these demands may decrease with age or increase depending on the case. So let's take a look at what the research is basically showing in terms of how we can personally control and manage the stress in these areas. Now remember, we're comparing middle-aged folks to young adulthood. And so we're going to find what the studies are showing is that there's a greater sense of control over finances, work, and marriage in general compared to when we were younger. So that's good news. We seem more financially stable. We're probably in a pretty good job at this point. We're rising up the ladder of the corporate sort of scenario in most cases. Our marriage is stabilized. In this case, we're assuming that it's a good marriage and things are going well. The marriage maybe is growing at that sort of emotional level as we discussed earlier or in other parts of the chapter here in lecture. However, where we often feel less control is over our sex life and our children, because you have to realize, with the climacteric and the hormonal changes that are happening, it seems that that stuff is just sort of out of my control, and it's creating problems in terms of my how satisfying my sex life may be in some cases. Whereas with your children, now in most cases, they're older, they're fighting for their independence. You can't obviously control your children when they get older in terms of when they become an adult and make their own decisions. So it's kind of like you're feeling that that's slipping through your fingers, that your whole life you were doing everything for your kids and making all the decisions and supporting them. Now it's kind of like they're becoming their own person. They're becoming an adult and they're making their decisions for themselves. And so as a parent, you feel like that control is slipping away, basically. So it's interesting how there's differences in the sense of control in different areas. Sense of control is often associated with delaying onset of disease in middle age. So I thought that was interesting. There's this connection to health and how much in control we feel in terms of life stressors. So the sense of control seems to delay the onset of disease. That's good news. So in other words, if you feel in control and you're managing your stress well, these are the people that often are healthier, and they're delaying the onset of some of these age-related diseases that we've been discussing. We've also found in the research that in terms of reducing the frequency of disease in late adulthood, we also see a connection to this. So let me kind of explain that. People who feel in control, personally in control of their stress in middle age, often reduce the incidence of disease once they get older in late adulthood, when we would expect things to really go wrong. So it almost like prolongs it or seems to delay it, where people who are just succumb to stress and can't find a way to manage and cope with it are the ones that are getting sick earlier and having more symptoms and things like that. So obviously, stress in our lives and how we cope and deal with it are often related to health problems in many different ways. Okay, so the research is also showing some differences between men and women in terms of, in general, how we react to stress, regardless of your age. In this case, I think, in this case, we're probably assuming it's more adulthood, but certainly could apply to other stages. So with men, when it comes to dealing with stress, what the research is showing is that we often use this sort of fight or flight reaction to stress. Do you guys understand what I mean by that? In other words, you're standing up to confront the stress head on. You're going to fight it off, or you basically run away and withdraw. So for example, what we're finding with men, becoming aggressive, socially withdrawing when it comes to stressful events or happenings in our lives, or even turning to the bottle and drinking alcohol, or what we say in psychology as self-medicating. Sometimes we turn to the bottle to solve our problems. Now remember, these are averages. This certainly does not apply to every single person in our society and in the world. These are just some general trends they've been noticing when it comes to reactions to stress between men and women. Everyone's different in how they handle this, but if we kind of look at the averages, we kind of see that this is probably more true on the male side. Now, what about women? In general, what the research is showing is that women seem to be more vulnerable to stress when it comes to their social life compared to men. So involving family, involving romance, even with coworkers at work and those kind of concerns. We have found that in general, women are a little bit more susceptible and vulnerable to stress than men are when those areas. Now remember, that does not mean that men, we're bulletproof to that kind of stuff. We're just looking at the averages and comparing them. When it comes to stress, some psychologists use this phrase, tend and befriend, to describe how, what is the average response of women to stress. So either they're tending or they're befriending, or even possibly both. In other words, tending meaning seeking help, whether that's therapy, talking it out with someone, reading a self-help book. Women are probably more likely to do those things compared to men, but also to befriend, to seek social alliance with others, especially their female buddies. Remember, not necessarily, but on average, we find that women often seek that solace, to get that comforting support from their friends, to talk things out more so than men. Now remember, these are averages. There's always differences in that. I'm not trying to generalize or use stigmas and things like that. But this, if we're looking at what the research is showing in those average tendencies, this is kind of what we're seeing. The research is also showing that women seem to be more vulnerable to depression after divorce and after the death of a friend, for example. So in general, we do see that depression rates are higher for women compared to men. But remember, that could be just due to the way our society says you should cope with things. Remember, we said that women often are the ones that go to therapists to get help, and thus it's documented probably more in the statistics because of that reason. Where men, we want to deal with it on our own, we turn to the bottle, we do other things to sort of cope with stress and to avoid depression or cope with depression. So once again, even though the trends in the research kind of show that pattern, you have to kind of think about what are the sociocultural concerns or the gender roles associated with men and women in terms of where you live and how they deal and cope with depression. I think that's an important point. Remember, that does not mean that men do not get depressed or go to therapists or anything like that. But if we look at the average trends, we know that women are more likely to do that and to seek these social alliances and the comfort and solace of being with their friends in terms of depression more, okay? So hopefully this has educated a little bit. I hope you find the lectures interesting here, guys. So please move on to the next stage in the class and we will see you online.